Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Best Practices on Migration to Progress Application Server for OpenEdge. My name is Jessica Newton, and I'll be today's moderator. So let's start by quickly introducing you to our speaker for today. Today, we are joined by Chad Thompson. Chad has over 25 years of industry experience, favoring reality over formality. He is a passionate technology advocate with experience and insight that shed light and produce the aha effect on some of the darkest corners of application integration. I'm really excited to have Chad with us today, and now I'm going to turn it over to him to start the discussion.
Well, thanks for that wonderful introduction, Jessica. As always, it's great to be here and great to see a wonderful crowd, all these shiny people coming out to enjoy our presentation. Let's get right to it because we do have a lot of things to cover. So hopefully everybody is here for the PASOE migration webinar. If you're not, now's a good time to maybe find something else to do. But hopefully, if you stick around, you might find something interesting. We have nice shiny attendees, and it would behoove me to show off some of our nice shiny new things in the OpenEdge world. For example, our MCP server and OpenEdge RAG offerings are now up and available. If you go to your ESD site, you can download the bits and instructions as well. If anybody's been following along, hopefully you got the newsletters and the briefs, but OpenEdge 13 has been released and it's out to the public. And there are some very compelling reasons to upgrade to OpenEdge 13 if you haven't already considered it. All right, well, let's get right into it. When we're talking about PAS, one of the very important points is to look at the architectural differences or just the architecture of PAS. Then the differences would be between your classic WebSpeed or app server brokers. And the way we'll address this is there's a lot of questions that we get asked, both in professional services and tech support, and we get a lot of common questions. So we're going to try to address some of those questions, but try to give some more insight to the answers. Some of the important ones are what can you expect from your PAS journey, as well as how do you make sure that you're going to have a positive experience. One of the best things that you can do is strictly understand what PAS is and what it isn't, as well as how best to deploy it. And what you're really looking for is you want to have some level of stability in your application. Many of you who are already running PAS might have experienced all the different roadblocks or hurdles that you have to get over when you bring a classic application into the PAS world. And being a robust platform, this PAS platform that we've developed, you now have an opportunity to scale your deployments, and it's critical to take that into consideration up front. So understanding, planning for your stability, and planning to scale and monitor your PAS instances. One idea or one landscape or layout of what a PAS deployment could look like might be something similar to this, where on the far right you have all your internal business logic and your data, and as you work your way out to the left, out to your clients, you have the DMZ area, which is going to proxy your external requests inward towards your OpenEdge services, and of course all your different clients who consume your services. What we have here is a diagram of what the classic environment would look like, the classic app server or classic WebSpeed. So on the left, you'll notice that the classic client might be an ABL client, a Java client, .NET client. Communication might communicate with the OpenEdge name server to the app server broker, and of course down to the actual runtime, the agent, which is your ABL session. From the right-hand side, we have the HTTP client. Got a little picture of a browser there, which would communicate with the WebSpeed messenger, the CGI IP executable. Again, same idea where that executable communicates with the broker. and then that communication flows down to the agent where the actual ABL request is run. So in a classic broker point of interest point of view here, we have the OpenEdge admin server, which controls all your classic brokers, the OpenEdge name server, which is a very important distinction. We understand, or you should understand, that this is DNS for OpenEdge components, brokers, and other types of products. The broker himself is simply a Java process listening on a socket, and anytime that I run an ABL set of code, that's going to execute on the classic agent. That's just an app server session, or pardon me, an OpenEdge session. And if I wanted to run 5 requests in concurrency, right, at the same time, I would need to have 5 executing agents. Now, if we take that same idea and we look at what a PaaS type deployment might look like, we have subtly different things here. One of the things that is conspicuous by its absence is the OpenEdge name server. As I mentioned earlier, it was the DNS for OpenEdge components. If you're relying on the OpenEdge name server, when we switch over to PaaS, that name server is no longer used for the client to locate the PaaS instance. Now what your clients will rely on is simple DNS, right? Name, value, or host name IP address resolution. The platform that PaaS is built on is Tomcat, which is simply a Java container runtime, but we most know it as an HTTP web server. So communicating to PaaS is now web style requests. When you communicate with PaaS or through Tomcat again, that HTTP request becomes important. If you have long running requests that you're used to running 5 hours, 10 hours, running things, reports on your classic app server, remember that this is all communication to PaaS is done over HTTP. So it's an HTTP post to the Tomcat server, if you will. How long did HTTP requests typically last? Not 5 hours. So it's an important distinction. The other really important thing here is this idea of the MT, multi-threaded. Some people call it the MS, or multi-session agent, where in Classic you would have had 5 or 10 agents in order to have that concurrency of executing requests. In the PaaS world, we actually only have, say, 1 agent, but inside of that agent, there's a thread pool. And each one of those threads is an ABL session effectively. And that allows one executable, one agent, to furnish numerous requests concurrently inside that one executing namespace. As you move along and you're migrating to PaaS, you may already have some scripts, some internal maintenance routines, some other type of deployment strategies, and you might have scripted around, say, WTB-man to manage your web speed brokers, or ASB-man to manage your app server brokers. Well, in the PaaS world, those don't work anymore because we're not web speed and we're not app server. We are indeed PaaS, so we have PaaS-man. PaaS-man is simply a nice global wrapper for TC-man. They both perform the same functions, but at the end, if you've scripted around WTB-man or ASB-man, you're going to need to replace your or update your scripts. In Classic World, you would use something like maybe merge prop to update ubroker.properties. And that way you can configure and deploy your web speed or app server applications, and you can keep just snippets of the configuration in your SCM. In the PaaS world, we have the same idea, but we won't use merge prop. We'll use OE prop, where you'll apply the delta to your configuration. There's also sec prop, which allows you to go through your security settings inside of PaaS. In Classic world, we had simply the ubroker.properties to change settings for web speed or app server. In PaaS, there's a lot more, and that's a bit of an understatement. There's a lot more ways to tweak, tune, and configure the PaaS instance. Of all these files I have listed on the right-hand side, one of the ones that you'll spend the most time in is the OpenEdge.properties. However, you will also want to look at the Catalina.properties files. One of the key points when working with PaaS and getting to know it is logs. What's going on, what's going wrong, what's going well. One of the easiest ways to tell is simply looking at the logs. And who doesn't want more logs? In classic world, you would have the broker, broker log, which represents any output generated by that Java process, and the agent log, which of course, as it's named appropriately, is any output generated by the ABL session agent. On the right-hand side in the PaaS world, we now have Tomcat to look after. So he has Catalina logs, he's got access logs, any HTTP requests, any other plugins that he might have. The PaaS framework is built on top of Spring Security, one of the best of breed Java tooling frameworks out there for writing application platforms. So you'll have that layer also of it can spit out logs for you. So you'll have one specific to your web app. You'll also have some, if you enable different features, where it will show any authentication or authorization. I believe by default, these are set up out of the box to just be failures when somebody tries to log in and it doesn't work. If we logged all successful answers, it would become very, very, very loud. But all of these things, all of these logs are configurable, changeable on the fly for some of them, but they can give you as much information as you want or as little as you want. Let's see, is there anything else in here? Yeah, the last one, of course, is what's common between these two is the agent log. Here, this agent will keep track, on the PaaS side, will keep track of all the sessions that are running inside of your PaaS multi-threaded or multi-session agent. So if you were looking at agent.log in the classic world, you'll look at the name of your web app .agent, and there might be a date stamp in there .log for all of your ** or other types of messages. One of the key points when you're migrating to PaaS is have a plan. You really want to strategize. How is it that I want to lay out this product? How is it that I want to take my application and deploy it to PaaS? So one of the things that I like to look at is, and consider, and you might also, is where is it going to live and how am I going to access it? Where is my PaaS supposed to be? Well, it's a web server, so shouldn't it be out by the web? Well, yes and no. It might look like a web server, but it's really just a replacement for your app server brokers. It's purpose built to be a broker replacement. So wherever your brokers are is a good spot to start. Going from left to right here, of course, what you'd want to know is from where your PaaS instances live, are there any firewalls? Are there any network blockers or anything in between where the consumers are, where the clients are, back to where that broker actually lives? What ports need to be open? How am I going to be accessing that? Remember, your classic services, while they are being migrated to PaaS, the way they're configured and the way they run and the way they work today is very important. So you'll want to identify your broker definitions and have those at hand. A previous slide mentioned briefly in the pro tips that there is a conversion script that you'd want to run to take your original configuration and migrate it to PaaS configuration. It's a one-time thing, I would suggest. It's a single-use script, and it gets you started quickly. Also, another part that you're going to want to evaluate and understand is, what are my clients that access my current brokers, whether WebSpeed or app server? I know that I've got ABL clients. I know that my accounting department likes to run the WebSpeed application. I know that we've got an interface to an external vendor. Make sure you know not only who your clients are, the consumers of the service, but don't forget the ancillary services. Is it important for me to know that we have those RF guns in the warehouse? Do we have other types of reporting applications that might be accessing some of the data over the wire from your broker services? So get a really good picture of what your application landscape looks like, and don't forget the ancillary services. So right away, what do we want? What do we need from this deployment? Well, right away, which processes are critical to my business operations? I know that that inventory management suite needs to run. So maybe that's a high important, high focus area. And are there any parts of my application deployment that maybe I haven't considered? Ask yourself these questions. Now, as you start looking at your application on a siloed vertical basis, you'll start looking at the application source. Start taking an inventory of all the assets in their entirety. Images, style sheets for web speed stuff, don't forget those. And on the app server side, look for maybe config files that get read from disk. If you're switching machines, switching physical servers where you're deploying to, watch for configuration file drift. Are there shell scripts? Are there JSON files and other things on disk that I might need to bring also? Here is one of the most important things that you need to consider in your evaluation of your upgrade to PaaS is be honest. When you look at your application source code and you test it underneath PaaS, and all of a sudden there's ginormous amounts of RAM being used up. Well, that's a PaaS thing, right? Well, be honest with yourself. Is it really? Is it really PaaS? Now, it's going to behave differently. It's going to look differently. But how can I solve that problem? I'm seeing exponential memory growth. Be honest with yourself. I promise you, it's probably your code. If you expect these problems, if you expect these challenges to come up, expect to make changes, expect changes to be necessary, and make them, or at least make the plan, make the time to do it. One of the biggest lies in IT, I'll put it to production and I'll change it later. Never happens, right? Assign subject matter experts or owners to the projects. I am the inventory application specialist. All right, I need you to understand how the application works today, how it's going to work tomorrow, so that you can judge as the subject matter expert. You can judge if there's problems, performance, or some functionality deficit. And then, of course, set your goals for what you want out of this application. Is it just a lift and shift? Am I just upgrading to PaaS? Or are there other things that I need in there? For example, these are two important points. Do we have any authentication or authorization strategies? How do I authenticate access to my application? And how do I allow certain identities to perform certain tasks? That is a very, very big key component of implementing PaaS securely. And then, of course, the last part here that is always an appendix and a bullet point, but it really should be a first-class citizen. Do you need TLS? Do you need SSL, HTTPS, right? All these things, they all mean the same thing. Do I want encryption on the wire of my data while it's in transit? I'll help you out. The answer is yes. You should put TLS everywhere and think of it first. It should be a first-class citizen. So as you move along in your migration process, it's important to be critical of yourself, be critical of the process, and again, be honest with yourself. Is it really a problem, or is it something where we just have to get around? We have to get over. This second at the top here, the second box, test, 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 and test some more. Too often we hear, oh, we put our app onto PaaS and we put it into production and it blew up. All right, how long was your testing cycle? What did you do to test? Well, we didn't. We put it underneath we set up a PaaS instance, we put our code underneath, it ran, we went to prod. You're going to want to stress this. You're going to want to stress your application underneath PaaS. As you've probably all heard before, the defaults are always wrong. There is no way for OpenEdge engineering or the default settings inside of PaaS to know what number of sessions and agents you need to facilitate your application. Get used to Clean deployments of PaaS. So deploy the PaaS instance with the code. My advice would be to tear it right down, delete it, start again, go back through the deployment process again. That part of your CI/CD process leads to clean application, clean deployments, and everybody getting a good night's rest once you go to production. Bottom left on this slide talks about concurrent load testing. So when you're performing your testing, when you're stressing the application, don't take one user and go click, click, click and test through each screen. Have a designed or a plan that you can apply and say, we are going to do this as a team and we're going to test our application at scale. Concurrency is key. And the last thing here that is one of the most often oversighted or missed points, test for failure. Shut it off, shut PaaS down and see what your clients do. We know that the request shouldn't last for over a minute or two. Okay, run something that runs for 5 minutes, then request again. See what happens. Test for failure. So the secret of success to working with PaaS is setting the your expectations. And too often I hear, well, we were told that PaaS is just an app server replacement, so it's going to just work. Well, yes, but you have to be realistic about it. Most of you may have already heard PaaS is not classic app server. It is a completely different animal. Not only the way it's structured and deployed, but at runtime too. It is vastly different, so don't expect it to run the same. If you're running the REST adapter in your current classic environment, the REST adapter would have been deployed to a secondary Tomcat instance. Now that REST adapter is built into Tomcat. We call that the REST transport. You can see that on the slide here where it says /REST/. Same thing with SOAP. In classic world, you would have had the SOAP adapter, the WASA, running on a separate Tomcat container. Here, you can take your projects, your .par from the REST project or the WSM from your SOAP project, and you can redeploy those to a PaaS instance. And then again, test. For anybody running the AIA, the App Server Internet Adapter, that is our, in the PaaS language, that's our APSV transport. So where you would have had that AIA component running in a separate Tomcat container, we now have the APSV transport. So there's no need to have a separate Tomcat container to run these components. You now have PaaS with all those components built in, and your projects will deploy to those. On your client, say it's an ABL client or a .NET or Java open client, the one thing that certainly needs to change out there is how do we connect to the PaaS broker or the PaaS instance. The typical way that a lot of customers connect to classic application is going through the OpenEdge name server. If you're using direct connect style connection, that means you're going directly to the OpenEdge broker port. Here, what you would need to do in the PaaS world is you need to switch out that connection string. You need to switch it out to have -URL and then HTTPS, whatever your host name port, if there's a web app path in there, /APSV. That indicates to the ABL or .NET client that I'm connecting to a PaaS instance, and we're going to use HTTP to perform the communication. In your WebSpeed world, that uses the WebSpeed messenger. I mentioned it earlier, the CGIIP, CGIP executable that we put on the web server. We no longer use a CGI executable underneath PaaS. Instead, you use the /web transport. So whenever I hit /web under a PaaS URI, that says, hey, PaaS, behave in WebSpeed's style. Now, typically, you can take your embedded speed script or your CGI wrapper code. Maybe you compile it to .r, because we all do that, drop it underneath, or make it available to your PaaS instance via ProPath, and that should work just fine. Now, even if it does work first try, is there anything I can do better? Significant in this list that I'm looking down here, if you're using the second entry, if you're using mapped HTML in your web speed application, that's one thing that we highly recommend. In fact, I believe the term is not supported underneath PAS. You're going to want to re-implement those in either a web handler, or if you have to, put it into some flavor of a CGI wrapper or embedded speed script. But if you have any level of mapped HTML web objects, you're going to want to rethink that strategy. If your clients, your HTML accessing browsers, things like that, if they have the URL hard-coded in there where it has either wservice equals or cgip.exe on the URI, that will need to either be replaced or changed in that HTML code or in that HTML client, or you can use a reverse proxy to rewrite the URL. So if it sees a classic URL come in, it can be switched on the fly, and that request can be passed down to a PAS instance. The last line on this table on the right talks about your static assets, JavaScript, style sheets, images. Where should they go? In my previous diagrams where PAS might have been buried deep inside your infrastructure, your enterprise, all the way back by the database, is that where my images that I'm showing to my web clients should go? Well, if you're reverse proxying that far, by rights, you can put them back there. However, it might be more beneficial to consider relocating those images, style sheets, either out to a CDN, a content delivery network, or at least out to somewhere on the periphery of your network, say in the DMZ. One PAS broker, one PAS instance should, for your beginning process, should represent one classic broker definition. It doesn't have to, but an easy way to start learning is to treat a PAS instance like a broker instance. As you start creating your different instances, my advice, my pro tip number 2 here, or pro tip, is to keep a spreadsheet of what the instance name is, where it's located on disk, what is its HTTPS, HTTP, AJP, especially if it's enabled, and these are ports, and don't forget pro tip number 2 at the bottom. You can use a shutdown port near too, so track that shutdown port. If you set a shutdown port to anything better than 0, Tomcat or PAS will listen on that socket for a magic word, and if anybody communicates on that wire and sends the magic word down the wire, Tomcat will shut itself down. If you use -1, that disables that feature. However, it also takes down a couple other small little features that you might want to keep in play. Keep in mind, this is when you create instances, track all the ports, including the shutdown port. They all have to be unique, unless you're using -1, of course, but they all have to be unique on the running machine. If we have more than one instance, we want to have everybody having their own unique port numbers. And oh, by the way, one thing you don't want to do is open up that shutdown port outside the firewall. Even if you're still inside your network, there's no reason to have that shutdown port outside of the PAS server. The other ones, HTTP and HTTPS, should be opened up outside that firewall. All right. The most sage advice I can give you is this, is target production today. Even though you might be redeveloping your PAS application or your classic application targeting PAS, start it even in development mode, or pardon me, development time, start it in production. Practice the way you play. Nobody gets to game day by phoning it in. And if they do, they don't go very far. So why should I be in development world testing development things, and then when I go to production, expect it to run perfectly? How am I going to handle errors? How am I going to handle exceptions that might happen in production if I haven't already experienced them early? So my advice again is early on, get used to using the tooling and try to resist the urge to use the web interface because it might not be there in production. As well, when you create an instance, use the -Z prod. That will shut down all of the transports. You'll be forced to opt into the security or allowing different transports, and it changes some of the behavior of the PaaS instance to mirror what your production runtime is going to look like. As well, the last point here, something went wrong. Okay, what component is going to require my focus to go and fix? Is this a Tomcat issue? A port is already in use? Is this some kind of a Spring security thing where when a request comes in, it was I received a 401 or something to that degree where I wasn't permitted to facilitate that request? As well, where else could an issue arise? Well, how about it down inside of the different PaaS classes itself, like the session manager? Is he trimming sessions that were in use or shouldn't have been? Are there not enough sessions provisioned? And of course, we can adjust our visibility into that in a number of different ways. One of the easiest, of course, is just turning up the logging on it. But once we have done that, remember, it's not something that you want to leave on for production. It's something that you want to learn about so that when you go to production, you only see the errors. And then, of course, where everybody loves to live, because we're all open edgers here, is down at the agent level. Is this where I need to go and look? When a request came in, it was connected to Tomcat. It got through the security. PaaS did its job, but I still got an error back. Well, that means it must have been down at the ABL level, right? Well, if you've decided that, you're going to find that answer in your agent log. And of course, look for your star errors in that log. Another piece of advice that I can give anybody out there, there are two big settings that you're going to want to look at your agent level logging. One is deferred logging, where PaaS will keep track of debug messages or more detailed 4GL trace style logging. And you can leave your general runtime logging in the PaaS agent to be just standard issue, show me an error, show me some information. If you've chosen to use the deferred logging option inside of PaaS, should the worst happen, should that agent crash, well, I better go look at the logs. Well, hold on, I only had my logs set to minimal. That deferred logging has been keeping track of all these loud messages, and it'll only keep track of a certain number of the last things that happened. But when things go bad, that information will be written to the agent log. Interesting little tidbit here is that deferred logging can be flushed at any point that you want. So you can keep your logging, typical logging, at a normal, sane level, and then enable deferred logging, and at key points, maybe issue the call to PaaS to tell it to flush its deferred logging so you can see what was going on at that particular moment in time. When you enable PaaS, a PaaS instance for production mode -Z prod, it is secure by default. So everything has been shut off, everything has been password protected, things have been disabled. So it's secure by default, and anything that you want to use or turn on, you have to opt in for that. You have to enable these features. However, HTTPS, the HTTPS transport is always there, right? So now we have our SSL. One of the things I would highly recommend is that treat SSL and HTTPS as a first-class citizen. Don't leave it till we go to prod. Get it done early. Know how to do it cold in development level. And even though PaaS is HTTPS enabled out of the box, the certificate that comes with it isn't entirely valuable. You will get the encryption, but you won't get the trust or the you won't get the trust out of it. The certificate is good, I believe, until 2036, so we've got some time, but don't waste that time. Figure out how to deploy SSL to PaaS immediately. One of my favorite things to do is use Let's Encrypt or some other external service. For example, Let's Encrypt is a free service with an API that you can call that delivers you SSL certificates, fully vetted, above board SSL certificates for free. So I don't need to break out my credit card and go to GoDaddy.com anymore. I'll just call Let's Encrypt using some flavor of an automation tool. In this case, I've just put certbot. So if you do an internet search for certbot, you'll get a lot of answers. And what that means is I'll set up certbot on my server, tell it to call Let's Encrypt, retrieve a new SSL certificate for me, and inject that into my Tomcat runtime. This is something that it automates itself, and it will check, do I need a new certificate every 90 days by default. Another really interesting point here is letting Spring manage the authentication and role-based authentication, authorization control. And the subtle difference, right, between authentication and authorization. Authentication, do I know who you are, or are you who you say you are? And then, of course, authorization, can you, now that I know who you are, can you do what you're asking for? So the advice here is letting Spring do that work. Let PAS do the heavy lifting for you. If you're down in your ABL code and you're finding yourself comparing user entered passwords to the encode value of a user name database table, I don't want you to be the last person touching that code, because when it goes bad, when that gets exploited, your name is going to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal saying, hey, we just got hacked. If there was no password to keep, that is the ultimate goal. Now that I've got a validated principal, I know who this person is, I can now focus on, in my application code, do I have a principal or don't I? If I don't, I fail. Is the principal valid? If it's not, fail. If I have a valid principal, all right, what is he permitted to do? What is this principal object permitted to do? And I can look at his roles, his scopes, his abilities, and compare that to what's trying to be run. Integrating with external authentication services, pretty much out of the box. LDAP and Active Directory, OAuth2 or OIDC, PAS covers all of these with minimal configuration. There is no code to write under those 2 points. You just fill in the blanks, restart PAS, start testing your authorization and authentication. Of course, we have the OpenEdge Authentication Gateway. PAS can use the authentication gateway as another point of authentication. So instead of asking my Active Directory service, I can configure my PAS to call my OEAG, my authentication gateway instance, and say authenticate this user ID and password. One of the highest, most important things that I find myself praising, and for anybody who's getting into the PAS world, is this: implement a reverse proxy. I have seen where people will have their PAS instances running back on their database, and they poke a hole in firewall all the way out to the external world. That is no bueno. That is not best practice for certain. However, if I put in Nginx, if I put in an Apache web server with a mod proxy, anything, now I don't need my PAS port exposed to the world. Now I only expose my web server port to the world. And in the diagram that's up on the screen here, the DMZ, maybe it's cloud hosted, maybe it's inside your colo location, but that's where you would put, or that's a very good spot to put your reverse proxy, and it proxies inbound. Instead of just surfing the web and proxying outbound requests, it proxies inbound requests. Here's an easy one. Here's an easy option for why you would want this. Number one would be web speed. As I mentioned earlier, we don't use the web speed messenger. No more CGI IP on the URL. No more W service equals. We use /web. How am I going to replace that in all of my HTTP or JavaScript code? All right, if I put a reverse proxy in, not only am I more secure because I'm not opening all these holes and all these ports through all these firewalls, but I also have an opportunity that when a web speed client or a web call comes in and it has that W service equals on the URI, I can now, in my reverse proxy, rewrite that URL and proxy it down to PaaS in the format that PaaS is looking for. Other key points here: load balancing, caching, and routing. I actually like saying, why not put a reverse proxy out in the DMZ, but put one back on your end, where your PaaS instances are actually running. Put one back there too, so it's proxy to proxy. Now my number of ports in my firewall that I have to open are exceptionally minimal. I only need port 443 because anybody reverse proxying back to PaaS doesn't need to know the specific port of that PaaS broker. He only needs to know HTTPS, which is port 443. So now I'm much more secure, much more performant, much more flexible. Other ones that I like to use here for reverse proxying, you can use IIS. It works fine with rewrite and ARR, application routing, application request routing. Nginx is a very good one. That's how Nginx even came into existence. Its first job in life was to be a proxy server. Traffic is a good one, and also, say, for example, the Azure or AWS application load balancing. I breezed through that pretty quickly. We've got all the slides and all the PDF material is up on my GitHub repository, and you can access this URL right away. It's been published. We'll also be putting links up to that website for where you can review the video, as well as some links back to the community for discussions. I also have the discussions feature turned on in that repository. I haven't primed it with anything yet, but I intend to do that in the coming moments. So that was a pretty quick overview. I wanted to give us some time to review if there's any questions.
Sounds good. All right, thank you so much, Chad. That was great. So as a reminder, if you have any questions, just please put those in the questions panel. I do have some questions asking for a recording of this webinar session. So once the recording is available, we will share it with you. The recording should be available about 24 to 48 hours after the event, and we will send it to the email address that you registered with. So Chad, are you ready to get started with the Q&A?
Oh, yeah, fire away. Are you going to read me some questions, Jess?
Yes, I'm going to read off some of the questions that we've received so far. So this first one is, I heard that PaaS-OE cannot connect to the database is shared memory. Is that true? And what are the advantages of connecting PaaS-OE to the database over the network?
That's a really great question. Yes, it can connect over shared memory, but if PaaS does decide to go sideways, if anything goes up in smoke, do I want PaaS taking my database down with it? Well, no, that's a bit of a risk. So it's up to you, and it really depends on your application and how it's coded. So for each customer, break by this, where that, and if you don't have efficient sorting or filtering or bracketing, if you choose to go across the network to the database, if you haven't tested that, you might find out that your code isn't as efficient as you might want it. However, I do recommend taking that effort and enabling the remote connection to the database from PaaS. It forces you to write good code, as well as if you decide to go to the cloud and you want to scale horizontally, right? Clustering, Kubernetes, things like that. That's where you're going to find some advantages to running networked.
Okay, great. And is there a way to automatically migrate the PaaS configuration from an old OpenEdge version to a new OpenEdge version?
Yeah, and is it two PaaS configurations?
Yeah, migrate the PaaS configuration from an old OpenEdge version to a new OpenEdge version.
Ah, okay. So yes and no. There are a lot of changes. If you had, say, an 11.7, you're an early adopter of PaaS, or even a 12.2. As PaaS has evolved, and our dependencies, say, for example, we include Tomcat. If you're on 12.2, you have Tomcat 9. If you're on 12.8 or better, you're probably Tomcat 10. If there's any Tomcat differences, those you probably wouldn't want to migrate. Just leave them, just run that Tomcat version. But there's also Spring settings. You won't necessarily want to migrate by copy and paste, because I know what migrate sometimes means to our audiences, right? Copy and paste the file and it works. There's a lot of subtle little differences where the version of Spring is tracked. So my recommendation is know what your configuration or what files made up that original environment, and compare it to your new environment, and then copy in, right? Migrate in or merge in the changes. The last thing I'll say is web apps. The actual web app deployment pattern, when we deploy an ABL web app, you will want to be able to rebuild that web app at any time. You will want your build process version to match your target PaaS version. So if I'm targeting a 12.8 PaaS OE instance, when I build that WAR file, that web app deployment file, I want to make sure that I'm targeting a 12.8, and I include 12.8 configuration files.
Okay, so another common question around, which versions to migrate to. So this person says, I'm currently running an 11.7 with the old app server. So should I migrate to PaaS OE on 11.7, or should I use a 12.8 environment to do the migration?
So if you're coming from an 11.7 environment, should I try out PaaS on 11.7 and then go through the effort of going to 12.8? And I think it's a relatively good practice. If you're not used to PaaS, get used to it. Get used to living with it. And if you have an 11.7 classic app server and 11.7 PaaS, now you can compare apples to apples. Is this going to work for me? Are my scripts going to work? And then now that I've learned a lot about how PaaS operates and how my application operates underneath PaaS, now I can go through the effort of going up to 12.8. Now that's what I would consider a best practice strategy. There are other people who would say just go to 12.8 because you get all the good bells and whistles and all the updates and security features, which is true. So what you won't be able to do there is test apples to apples. You won't be able to compare. Here's how it used to run. Here's how it runs now. You will be able to compare, but it's really not a fair comparison at that point.
Okay. This person says, I came in late, so not sure if Chad talked about it, but in one installation at customer site, I couldn't go in the OpenEdge Explorer anymore. What do I need to check? Or should I switch to the OpenEdge Command Center?
Oh, okay. Well, OpenEdge Command Center is your single pane of glass that communicates to all of your admin servers, and you can see the instances running of databases as well as app servers and PaaS instances. If you can't get to 9090, right, OpenEdge Explorer web interface, that's the default port. If you can't get there, is it even installed? Is the product or a product that gives you that license and that feature, is it there on that machine? Is the firewall open, of course? Is the service even running? Now, one of the things that I've seen before is people deploy PaaS. PaaS is very portable. You should be able to install a PaaS license, zip an instance, unzip it wherever that target server is, and you're good to go. PaaS is going to run just fine. It doesn't need the admin server. It doesn't need the OpenEdge name server. It runs pretty much standalone. So if you're accessing a machine where PaaS is, it's probably because it doesn't have the admin server and it doesn't have a license on it like database or the standalone OEM or OEE licenses, and you won't have that web interface. A few slides back, I mentioned get used to PaaSman, TCman. Get used to working on the command line, as well as you can provision using Ant, using Ansible, things like that.
Okay. This question is a 2-agent with each 200 sessions still enough for 400 requests?
2 agents with 200 sessions and connections, enough for 400 concurrent requests. Now, and then the second part of that, license for only 2 processes. So as far as the processes go, right, your license says how many agents you can run. I try not to get involved in any of the debate about licensing further than that, but 2 agents with 200 sessions apiece. So think about 200 threads. If I threw 400 requests at it, remember these are HTTP requests that are going to flow down through Tomcat, PAS, all the way down to your agents and your ABL code. So the next difference is it web or APSV? If it's an APSV, a web application, web speed style, I would say yes, you'll be able to do 400 things concurrently. That would be more than enough. If 400 requests came in and reached the agent, then that's more than enough. That's fine. However, on APSV, it might change subtly if your application requires session managed mode, right? 400 requests, you might find yourself choking down a little bit here or necking down a little bit. However, as you shift out to the left from the agent through PAS, Tomcat out to the client, at the Tomcat level, Tomcat has a thread pool. Every request that he receives pulls 1 off that thread pool, and that gets sent down to run ABL code. So it's consumed for the life of that ABL code. The default setting in most Tomcat instances is 300, which means Tomcat can handle 300 concurrent HTTP requests. You might have 400 sessions down at the ABL level, but Tomcat's only letting 300 at a time come to it. So yes, I would say that's enough because Tomcat is going to be your, if I will, bottleneck, right? If it'll neck down, it will queue and it will buffer requests down to PAS. If you want all of those 400 requests to execute at the same time, your 2 agents, 200 apiece, gives you 400 ABL things. Make sure you match that at the Tomcat level. Put 400 executor threads for 400 sessions. Now you've got max concurrency at that point. Still, test.
Yep. Okay, great. This question is, what is the best way or tool to determine the optimal value of the parameters max ABL sessions per agent, max agents, and max connections per agent?
Okay, so all those maximum values, from the last question, we had the 200 max sessions and connections per agent. For running 2 agents, that gives us 400 max concurrency. So how do I decide what is a good number? Test. Now, it really comes back to 2 main things. Are you running web? Are you running APSV? So if you're running web or web speed replacement inside of PAS, right, the web transport, it's meant to be a little bit more ephemeral, quick, snappy requests, short-lived requests, because they're web requests. So you might see that if I use those previous numbers, you might see that 200 is a good number, because even though you have 500 requests coming in, they're so short, the sessions will be reused and you end up having enough. An APSV style application, right? A classic app server style connection, a thick GUI or open client. You'll want to test that because it really matters. Are you running session free or are you running more of a state aware mode? In my previous slides, it was up there as a tip or a hint, but when you change your connection to PAS from the client down to the server, it's important to note that in classic world, you would define the connection state reset, state less, state free. You would do that at the broker level. In PAS, we do that at the client level. The client now says, I need you to run this for me. And oh, by the way, I plan to come back, so I'm state managed. So it really matters. Now, how can I tell? Start with a configuration that you think is close, and that's usually using the PAS prop conv, right? That conversion script I mentioned earlier, that gets you close. Start with that if you think it's sane. Test it. Watch, did I spin up another agent? Did I use all of my sessions? As well, of course, are my users happy? Now we can tweak and tune from there. It's probably because I need another session, or maybe I should reduce my sessions and increase number of agents, but these are knobs and dials that you'll have to tweak and tune. Only
Sounds
you
good.
know. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we have time for one more question. So this person is saying an 11.7 client server application that presently uses app server only to make operating system calls to the database server, excluding re-architecting the client server app. Would migration from classic app server to PaaS be as simple as just changing the app server connection strings in the ABL client code?
So the key point there is operating system calls. What I hear, input output through some flavor of OS command statement, or just straight up OS command. In the multi-threaded world, what ends up happening, we're looking for max concurrency. And in a multi-threaded world, one agent, if you go off, a request comes in and you go off and you start to say, read in from this directory or input output through curl or something like that, that thread is forking off another thread and another sub process, and it gets very, very, very expensive. It gets expensive from a thread management and mutex and all these other engineering terms, but it also gets expensive from a memory point of view, because when we fork and exec sub processes, they're actually clones of the main. You'll see your memory impact, or pardon me, your memory will be impacted negatively. It will grow, but you will also see your concurrency drop because the different threads are tying up the ability for other requests to be processed. So short of re-architecting, if you can't change the code, what you may have to do is run PaaS in what we affectionately call classic mode. However many agents you need to get the job done, set their max sessions to 1. Nobody wants to do that. It's now classic behavior. We're trying to be in the future here. But if you can't change the code, even though you probably own it, that's probably one of your best bets. I would highly recommend reevaluating and re-architecting.
Sounds good. Alrighty, thank you so much, Chad. And for those who asked a question during the presentation that we couldn't get to, we will follow back with you in the email that you'll be receiving. So thanks again to everyone who attended today's webinar. We really appreciate your time and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.